This is the Tree of Life, Season 15, Chapter 4. In this episode, we will be talking about two ways of looking at a pairing of dialectical impulses within the context of a structural adjustment. To start out, let's imagine that you just quit smoking cigarettes, but have the impulse to smoke. You walk to a corner store to buy candy as a substitute for cigarettes. You resist the desire to buy cigarettes right up until you reach the cashier and buy candy instead. Then, while you are leaving, another individual enters the store, crosses your path, and purchases a pack of the same cigarettes, brand and type, that you would have bought had you not resisted the impulse. Now, we gave this example earlier as a form of displacement mirroring, an operation within a hybrid structure whereby one impulse, the negated impulse here, is redistributed to another to prevent infinite recursion. We can draw another lesson from this example. Specifically, in this case, the two impulses which were engaged by the intersection were impulse 1 by candy affirmed and impulse 2 by cigarettes negated. These two impulses are not objectively dialectical, but are rather contextually so. But what we can also observe is that these impulses are substitutes. That is to say, that impulse 1 is a substitute for impulse 2. You have gone to buy candy to resist a craving, to substitute for a reward that you would otherwise get by not resisting the cigarettes. Thus, what we see is that displacement mirroring, and in fact, the operations represented by structural adjustments, preserve the relationship between the two dialectical impulses in an objective sense. That is to say, that when an impulse is negated, through the substitution event, the impulse transitions to one which is dialectical by orientation, to one which is dialectical by class. This transition through a substitution event from a pairing of dialectical impulses, which are largely contextual, to impulses which are largely objectively defined, that is by class, as opposed to contextually, is a reflection of the relationship between the impulses ultimately determining the operation that structure undergoes. In other words, what we see is that the operations which prevent infinite recursion are designed to preserve the species of relationship between the dialectical impulses with respect to some structure member in the operation which the structure as a whole undergoes. This is interesting because it tells us that the negated impulse is redistributed to a proximate structure member by way of this operation as a substitution, just as the candy was a substitution for the cigarettes. It also tells us something about the relationship to a given object. Just as the substitution relates to two distinct objects, the substitution with respect to the negated impulse relates to two distinct structure members. Thus, there is a kind of balance between the conformational entropy represented by that operation and the information represented by the substitution of one object for another, relative to the first structure member. That's the end of the podcast for today.